Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session of the Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change Conference. So my name is Sally Haslanger. I'm a professor at MIT. I'm wearing a gray sweater with a scarf, sort of vegetable-like, vegetation-like print on it. I am zooming in from a hotel room in Paris where I'm attending another conference, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Now, I'd like to introduce Alex Bryant. Alex has a bachelor's degree in contemporary studies and philosophy. Contemporary studies is an interdisciplinary undergrad program that engages critical theory and contextualist intellectual history from the University of King's College and Dalhousie in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. He has an MA in philosophy from McMaster and is currently in the PhD program at the University of British Columbia. His research interests are primarily in social political epistemology, moral philosophy, group agency, and collective responsibility, especially with respect to political and legal systems and the political legitimacy of movements for social change and tactics related to belief revision, ideology, and consciousness raising. So he will be presenting his paper for about 30 minutes, and the remaining time of 20 minutes will be available for Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A and I will read them. And it's extremely important that because the session is live captioned, we will speak slowly and try to make clear with articulation our ideas. And I'm looking forward to Alex's presentation. It titled, "Is Ideology Talk Disability Talk?" Take it away, Alex.
Thanks so much, Sally. Good morning, everyone. I just want to start by giving my great thanks to Jonathan and Shelley for organizing this conference. It's been such a joy to get to do this again this year. Thanks especially to the AV support team at the Blatvic School as well. You folks have also been a huge help. So let me start. I'm going to share my screen now. I'll say in case the transcription is causing anyone trouble, I'm sure it won't, but in case it is of interest to you, I did create a transcript of this talk as well, if that's useful to you. So feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if that would be of use. So let me start by saying, I think political discourse, which treats others as if they're under the sway of a pernicious ideology, is pretty common. I think it's common, for example, to encounter political pundits of different political stripes, describing their opponents not merely as followers of competing political doctrines, but to talk in a condescending way about such people as being duped or tricked, if only those other people saw the errors of their ways, right? If only they knew. Maybe this is a recognizable feeling. Here's maybe a familiar looking cartoon. So here are a few cases I have in mind. I think for feminists fighting to support the rights of trans people, it sometimes looks an awful lot like so-called gender critical writers don't merely have a competing political doctrine, but are unusually incapable of seeing the errors of their own thinking. I think for leftists in the United States, it can seem like Donald Trump supporting Americans can be especially obstinate about things that are, at least it seems, clearly false, say about conspiracy theories. And even Donald Trump himself has often been represented not merely as an unskilled political leader, but also as a deeply unintelligent person. And so I raise these examples, maybe you can think of your own, but I raise these ones in the hope that at least one of them speaks to your intuitions. Maybe you've had a feeling like this before, or at least you've seen those other maybe less virtuous people have these kinds of feelings. So here's what I want to call that. I'm going to call talk that mobilizes those feelings ideology talk. And ideology talk, I'm going to say, involves representing others as holding the beliefs they do by virtue of their being under an ideological delusion or false consciousness. So the folk sense of ideology I suggest is at work here is just the kind of the classical Goysian one for those keeping score at home. It's not a sophisticated sense that actually I accept of ideology, what ideology amounts to. But in the case of ideology talk, I think it's useful to describe it as ideology. Notably for those present, I'm not associating this folk notion of ideology with those more sophisticated analyses in the more recent literature or at least not yet. So here's what I think happens with ideology talk. I think we use ideology talk when we treat the beliefs of our interlocutor as those which no autonomous agent would accept in light of good evidence. That is, we treat them as unresponsive to facts and good reasons. Ideology talk of this kind treats a person as if they fail to live up to a minimum threshold of epistemic capacity that we would think is constitutive of autonomy. By the lights of those who use ideology talk, then, the people they address are, I want to say, epistemically impaired. And as a function of this impairment, they're epistemically inferior. Now notice though, I haven't introduced a way to cash out the notion of impairment that's at work in this account of ideology. So we don't yet have a sense of what the inferiority claim is meant to mean. We could, in other cases of ideology talk, we might make sense of a group's epistemic impairment relative to another in different ways. It might be a matter of a skills difference between each group, or it could be with regard to differences in the powers of the group to assess evidence. It could even just be that different groups and different group members have access to different pieces of evidence, and so maybe they don't have the full picture. I don't think the reasons mobilized in ideology talk that support the epistemic impairment perception are as mundane as this. And so I'm going to propose two different ways that this epistemic capacity account is taken to be limited when we engage in ideology talk, each of which I'm going to identify as ableist in an important way. On this account, ideology talk is a matter of serious disesteem. What distinguishes ideology talk from mere criticism is the matter of treating another agent as if their epistemic impairment is either a consequence of or is constitutive of a cognitive impairment, such that the person in question is treated as disabled. That is, in each case, the explanation for relative epistemic inferiority is cognitive inferiority. And so just I'll flag this again because I want to really make sure this is clear. On the folk notion of disability, I'm suggesting lives in the background. A disability just is an impairment located in an individual. And in this case, I'm saying it's impairment of intelligence. It's not a view of disability I hold, and probably not one that anyone in the room holds, but it's what I'm suggesting lives in the background here. So here's the first species I have in mind. I'm going to call it ideology by disability talk. And the example above of treating Trump supporting Americans as if they fail to meet what critics take to be a threshold of intelligence illustrates this well. So for those mobilizing ideology talk, their view of their interlocutor as unintelligent provides a necessary piece of the causal explanation for members of the group being convinced of Trump's claims in politics. They are, so the thinking goes, cognitively disabled by the impairment of their intelligence, and so fall prey to ideology. No person of the intellectual capacity sufficient for epistemic autonomy, so this line of thinking goes, could be convinced of Trump's demagoguery and conspiracy theories. So the idea is that being convinced of these things is a symptom of their epistemic qua cognitive inferiority and is a symptom of a flaw in the individual psychology of the person or the group member being addressed. I just want to, okay, so sorry, I'm seeing a different slide than folks are looking at, but I think this is the right one. So hence also, and this is what the comic that I've put up on the screen is meant to illustrate, hence also the common mobilization of redneck or yokel stereotypes in political commentary on Trump supporting voters. One of the characteristic features of both stereotypes is a kind of naive lack of sophistication and lack of education, taken together to suggest to viewers a lack of intelligence. So the comic that's up on the screen is a person in a red hat that says MAGA on it, MAGA for Make America Great Again. And the comic reads, question, how many ignorant yokels does it take to reject science? The answer is 62,451,826, one to run for president, and the remainder to vote for him. So this, I take it, in the image itself, is a case where this kind of person that's being demeaned is represented as having a kind of cognitive impairment, quad disability. That deep association, I think, is going to be obviously ableist to the people in the crowd today, but I'm going to try to tease it out a little further. There are, of course, a ton of other wrongful class stereotypes being mobilized in these representations. But notice ideology talk doesn't simply criticize uptake of misinformation or reasonable resistance to uptake of evidence, but it's instead about the perceived incapacity of a person to revise their beliefs in light of good reasons to do so. It's this perceived incapacity by virtue of perceived impairment, which substantiates the notion that disability, in the sense cognitive impairment, explains ideology, and in this sense I mean epistemic impairment. Such people's beliefs and attitudes are not authentically their own because they've come under the sway of an ideology they don't have the means to resist. They're unduly influenced, and the reason for the influence has such an effect is cognitive impairment. Now, as I've said, people addressed by ideology talk have attributed to them not merely epistemic inferiority, but also corresponding cognitive inferiority and disesteem. And for this audience, the ableism of ideology talks so described might seem obvious. The pragmatics of a further ableist consequence of ideology talk as ableist speech, I think, can be explained in terms of what Mary Kate McGowan has called covert exercitives. So roughly, I'm going to say when a person engages in ideology talk, they enable the permissibility of treating an interlocutor in a way that's ableist, thereby doing harm to the interlocutor and to disabled people generally by perpetuating an ableist political community. So for the philosophy of language nerds in the room, here's the lovely Lewisian picture. When an agent engages in ideology talk, they make a move in the norm-governed activity of political discussion. By engaging in ideology talk specifically, the speaker's contribution simultaneously makes a conversational contribution with illocutionary force and enacts the permissibility fact, treat interlocutor X as, in a pejorative sense, disabled in Y way. And so in this case, the Y way is cognitive impairment. McGowan calls this parallel contribution to the conversation a covert exercitive act, which causally depends on the illocutionary act of ideology talk itself. So this is, I mean, maybe a little obscure for non-philosophers of language. So here's an illustration. The assertive illocutionary act of ideology talk has the content X is of disesteem for reason A, the meta intention that my interlocutor sees my intention to assert this content. So the utterance, for instance, so here's an illustration using the example of Donald Trump. The utterance, Donald Trump is a moron, has an assertive illocutionary force. The speaker expresses a belief regarding Donald Trump. This utterance simultaneously causes an indirect, what McGowan calls a covert exercitive, which changes the Lewisian score of the conversation in question, such that the mobilization of the term moron as an insult becomes permissible. That score change then has a triple effect. First, it has at least one illocutionary effect. It expresses the speaker's belief regarding the character of Donald Trump. Second, the illocution disesteems Trump by attributing to him a disesteeming feature, that of, on this view, being a moron. Third, the illocution has this parallel effect of enacting a series of permissibility facts in the conversation. Here are two examples. Treat Trump as cognitively disabled qua moron. So now it's permissible to do that, given what I've said, or at least one invites the permissibility of this. Second, it's acceptable to mobilize pejorative notions of disability. So you could tease this out. There could be other things being invited as permissible on McGowan's view, but these are just two examples. That same account is going to hold in the case of public speech to large groups. In those cases, though, the language game is quite large. So if ideology talk happens, say, on a public news channel or in the public media, it might have the effect of enacting that norm for a vast political community. it might invite the permissibility of pejorative discussion of disability in that group. Maybe this is obvious, the parallel move of treat Trump as cognitively disabled is ableist insofar as the attribution of low or lack of intelligence is the pejorative attribution of disability. So when we engage in ideology by disability talk, then we contribute to ableism by licensing the view that being cognitively impaired is worthy of disapproval. So now that I've introduced this ideology talk and described a species of ideology talk that I've called ideology by disability talk, I want to introduce a second species. This I'm going to call ideology as disability talk. And I'll just say at the beginning, there's a 4-panel comic on the slide. In the top left panel, it says, "There's not," and then a shred of evidence that me wearing a mask will protect me. And the illustration is meant to be that people speaking loudly are covering the people listening to them in perhaps COVID-laced particles. So this is meant to illustrate the case then that I'm going to give. This species of ideology talk that I'm calling ideology as disability talk is ideology talk where epistemic impairment is taken to be constitutive of cognitive impairment. And I think it's less obvious that this is ableist, but I'm going to try to show that it is. So here's a way to illustrate this. Charles Mills's analysis of white ignorance provides, I think, a classic account of epistemic impairment constituting a kind of cognitive impairment. On Mill's view, whites share an unrecognized epistemology of ignorance, whereby the historical conditions of race relations cause a robust set of racially specific barriers to white epistemic autonomy. The various social mechanisms which comprise white supremacist ideology bring about a situation of epistemic heteronomy, and that heteronomy is constitutive, on Mill's view, of cognitive impairment. Unfortunately, in Mill's phrasing, this is the blindness of the white eye, insofar as those barriers taken together are barriers to effective cognition. Now, let me get ahead of something here. I'm not saying that merely theorizing ideology in terms of the social bases of ignorance amounts to ideology talk, or at least I'm not saying that yet. Ideology talk involves the pejorative representation of others' beliefs as ideological. And so identifying the sense in which another person is constrained by a distorted perception of the world doesn't itself disesteem a person in the ableist way that I was raising before. As with ideology by disability talk, ideology as disability talk does attribute epistemic inferiority to its object in a disesteeming way. It says that the person is duped or under the sway of a kind of illusion. And so we treat that person as socially inferior in the sense of epistemically inferior. Now, the vaccine example. I think in the case of anti-vaccine movements, for example, ideology talk is sometimes addressed to the conditions under which one's capacities are limited. For instance, if you're stuck in a pseudoscientific echo chamber, rather than being addressed to the psychological makeup of an individual person. This is a case of say, they know not what they do, we might think. If only they were to break out of the circumstances they're currently in, their cognitive capacities would be restored to full force, and they'd be freed from the sway of ideological delusion. I think folk criticism of decision-making powers of cult members with limited access to outside information is probably also illustrative of this. Membership in, say, an especially remote cult seems to amount to a kind of cognitive impairment insofar as it systematically impedes someone exercising their capacities fully. So in these cases, the perception is that cognitive incapacity is a consequence of social constraint. And so ideology explains disability. Now, here's the trickier bit. I've said the problem of ableism for ideology talk. I've raised the problem of ableism for ideology talk generally in both cases. The case of ideology as disability talk sounds awfully close, however, to the way that some figures working on ideology describe the phenomenon itself. So here's a representative passage from Jason Stanley. He says, flawed ideologies are epistemologically disabling this is why they are flawed. Flawed ideologies prevent us from gaining knowledge about features of reality, including social reality. Now, on its face, this is perhaps not a shocking claim. As we've discussed, the notion of ideology operative in ideology talk takes the problem of ideology to be a kind of epistemic impairment. In both cases, we find the epistemology of ideology conceived as a disabling impairment. And I think we should put pressure on this approach to theorizing ideology. So I'll stick with Stanley's comment as a working example. Stanley, among others, trades on a realist view that I find intuitive. There really are features of reality that people perceive. This is roughly, I'm going to say, indirect realism about perception. And sometimes there are impediments to our perception of those features. So one way to be epistemically impaired by ideology is just to be obstructed from perceiving features of reality. That impairment could be analyzed in three ways. Could be that ideology obstructs perceptual access, could be that ideology obstructs belief revision, and it could be some combination of the two. And so the problem of ideology is going to be different in each case, as might be the expected cure, as it were. Now, I think this view still lines up with Mills's view of how white ignorance operates. On Mills's view, white ignorance is constituted by a series of analytically distinguishable cognitive components, which are in reality all interlocked with and reciprocally determining of each other, jointly contributing to, as I've said, the blindness of the white eye. A person's perception is colored by the conceptual apparatus through which their perception of the world is organized. So too by the way a person's self-representation is constructed against a backdrop of memory. On Mills's account, cognition is necessarily molded by the social world, and agents perceive with eyes and ears that have been socialized. And so like Stanley, I think Mills here is admitting of a kind of indirect realism. The conceptual array, he says, with which the cognizer approaches the world needs itself to be scrutinized for its adequacy to the world, for how well it maps the reality it claims to be describing. Now, while accounts like those of Mills and Stanley don't fall simply to treating the flaws of flawed ideological belief as a matter of individual psychological impairment, I think they nevertheless mobilize a naturalized conception of cognitive impairment that licenses an ableist valuation of persons on the basis of, one, more or less direct perception of the world, and two, more or less responsiveness to reasons. And in doing so, I want to suggest they're smuggling in precisely the ableist conception of inherent inferiority we found in our discussion of ideology talk before, except now it's dressed up in an Enlightenment image of unencumbered perception, intelligence, and rationality. And of course, as the audience here likely knows, Shelley Tremaine has problematized precisely the conception of impairment I'm suggesting lives in the background of some accounts of ideology. Tremaine writes, the epistemological and ontological status attributed to disability and its putative foundation, that is impairment, are, she argues, historically and culturally relative and specific. And as such, the apparent self-evidence of claims about disability and impairment ought to be treated with deep suspicion. On the view Tremaine advances, disability names a specific matrix of possible actions which interact with other matrices of action. And that matrix is naturalized by the knowledge practices of medical, juridical, and other regulatory structures. And here I'm saying by specific philosophical structures. One is disabled by virtue of the subject position one occupies within this arrangement of possible action, which serves to limit possible conduct. And so there are thus no pre-discursive people with disabilities, but rather people are disabled by many overlapping and historically specific forces that construct the range of possible actions available at the time to a person. Now, I think this account of disability at least is compatible, that is the naturalized view, with what we find in Stanley and Mills. But Tremaine goes one step further and argues that the same is true of impairment. What it is to be impaired depends absolutely upon a matrix of relations of power, as does even the relationship between impairment, um, impairment and disability. And so there is no natural deficit or lack which could ground impairment as a natural phenomena, but only the historically specific and contingent arrangement of resources and arrangements of possible conduct. We're impaired relative to a particular matrix of possible action, but we don't have impairment independent of this matrix. And so I'm going to start to wrap up here. While Tremaine's project is largely addressed to feminist bioethics, I think her problematization of the assumptions about impairment and disability in bioethical research are informative for our analysis of ideology talk. Tremaine has argued at length that the very assumptions upon which feminist bioethics purports to develop answers to difficult ethical quandaries, in fact, serve to further harm disabled persons. And so I think something similar might be happening in this case with theorization of disability that naturalizes the conception of epistemic impairment as cognitive impairment. And so maybe the question we're left with then is impaired relative to what? It might be, as Sally Haslinger and many other feminist philosophers of science have argued, that the notion of the rational subject and the epistemic norm of objectivity are themselves radically historical and culturally specific. Well, in fact, I think this, and a few people in the room, of course, think this. In this case, then, what it is to be cognitively impaired is a conception whose relativity follows from the relativity of its target, what it is to be epistemically autonomous, and the norms of epistemic agency. So if being under the sway of an ideology is such that one is powerfully resistant to rational belief revision, one is, at least on this naturalized view, in a way irrational, at least within the operative domain of ideology. And we should worry about just how much a notion of objectivity and a notion of rationality are being smuggled into those accounts. The question that Tremaine wants us to ask is whether the rational belief revision expectation is historically and culturally specific as a criteria. And I think it is. So let me wrap up. And I think I'm on time. If I've succeeded in this talk, I've convinced you of two things. First, that much as we encounter ideology talk in day-to-day life, indeed, much as we might have times where we feel pulled to think or speak in terms of our interlocutor's unintelligence, ideology by disability talk and ideology as disability talk are each morally objectionable. Second, if I'm lucky, I've pushed you to reflect on the way that some work in epistemology, especially that which is addressed to ideology, might be trading on a transhistorical notion of impairment that is similarly objectionable. Now, in light of the first conclusion, we might need a new way to engage in everyday speech surrounding the effects of ideology upon our interlocutors. Here's my suggestion. Ideology talk might not be ableist if the ground upon which we leveled the pejorative attribution of ideological belief was some background notion of vice rather than disability. So it's possible that one engages in ideology talk that's deeply critical without falling into the ableist assumptions that I've suggested. It might be that when we engage in ideology critique for the sake of friends and family, what we're actually doing is a kind of vice epistemology. We aim at the conditions that constrain our peers in their thinking, and we discuss how those conditions have contributed some features of their character. Unlike the transhistorical notions of disability and impairment, which appear to be operating in the background of some ideology talk, I think if we ground it in a vice epistemology, this critiques address pieces of a person's character that they can control, so they don't seem like inherent impairment. But that's just a suggestion. I'm not sure if that's where we really need to go. And given the second conclusion, we now have a new criteria for the assessment of theories of ideology. Our philosophical investigations into the nature and effects of ideology ought not itself to end up building ideologically loaded concepts into the framework. This is not completely avoidable, I think, but I hope the irony of the problem can hold our attention as we do the work of deconstructing and abolishing ableism together. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Alex, that was fantastic. And I really found it illuminating and important to think through. So I'm going to start with a question, and then I'll move on to another from the audience. So I have a view according to which all cognition is shaped by our social circumstances, and all of us. So there's no kind of natural epistemic capacity that we're going to compare each other in relation to. What we're all shaped by the languages we speak, the cultures that we're in, the concepts that are made available to us. But some of the shapings are better than others. Some of the concepts that we are offered are better than others. And they're better than others because of, one, how they, what they highlight in the world as meaningful or appropriate to take into account in our reasoning and things like this, and how they organize us in interaction. So I want to, because they can organize us in ways that exploit people or disregard people, disrespect people and such. And so on one hand, I'm inclined to say, well, there's no natural cognitive attitude, state against which others are being compared. But there's there's still a sort of moral evaluation of the aptness of these background frameworks, what I call cultural technes. And I do like to focus on a critique of the techne rather than the critique of individuals, because individuals do what they can to pick up ways of being in the world, but it does sometimes have the consequence that I want to say this person has been shaped in ways that are problematic. And that ends up starting to feel a bit ableist to me. And so I'm trying to find a way to both, and you're pointing to a vice epistemology. I mean, I'm more inclined to sort of stick it, the critique at the social level rather than the individual level. But if I do start to say there's something misguided here, is that already something I should be cautious about and careful about as, potentially ableist?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for this question, Sally. So I'll just say, cards on the table. I actually think your account of ideology comes the closest to avoiding this problem, because I think so I'll say up to the account that you provide in the Aquinas lecture recently.
That's about as close to the present as you get.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So I think probably, and this I think is actually akin to a move that Elizabeth Anderson has made over the course of her career a few times. I don't think we're going to achieve, we probably are just reproducing a kind of fetish for objectivism if we take ourselves to be able to totally avoid this problem. But if we're honest about the project ultimately being pragmatic, ultimately that the claims that we're making about the aptness of belief or attitudes relative to, say, some standards that we're adopting as axiomatic for us, say we don't want to have an epistemology that privileges some kinds of cognition over others in a way that's ableist. We just say that up front. I actually think that diffuses a great deal of, say, the covert work that I'm saying McGowan helps us see when we theorize ideology in this way. So if one of the deep problems that I'm worried about, as Stanley's actually probably the clearest example of this. I think Mills' later work, rest in peace, Charles Mills, but I think Mills specifically was grappling with this kind of problem in his most recent work. And the best we're going to be able to do is going to be to identify and try to pragmatize the account of aptness that we give. We're not ultimately going to be able to get rid of that. So that's the first point. The second point regarding the vice epistemology stuff, I'm not actually convinced of like that's the total account that we ought to give. I think the reaction of saying maybe thinking in terms of epistemic vice is the most useful thing is just for discussion between individuals. So I don't think it captures ideology as such, but I also I'm sensitive to the fact, and I had this too, that we have these reactions to individuals, and we need kind of a heuristic to break out of the ableist intuitions that we have that can help us still have dialogue about our concern. Because often I'm struggling with like, here's the structural analysis of the problem here, and that's not very helpful at Thanksgiving dinner. It doesn't, right? So those are the two things. I'm not saying the problem can be reduced to treating things as a vice epistemology. So yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a question from Melinda. Melinda says, "Hi, Alex. Thanks for your awesome talk." And then they go on to say, "I've seen interesting work in recent years on slurs. For instance, the idea that slurs are objectifying because they're synecdochal. Do you see your work as having any overlap with political social analysis of slurs?"
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melinda. So this is a good question. I have an interest in doing more work in pragmatics, but I'll say I'm accidentally in pragmatics here. So I don't know the slurs literature as well. I probably read the slurs stuff now, oh my goodness, like almost 10 years ago now was the last time I dealt seriously with it. But I think that suggestion makes sense. So I imagine that the pragmatics are probably quite similar. I just don't know offhand the synecdochal account that you have. The angle I'm coming at it roughly from like, how do the social metaphysics that we're using and the epistemology we're building out of it end up yielding this kind of talk? And so I think I'm going to end up having to come at it from the other angle, as you suggest, eventually, to give a more robust account. But that's great. Thanks for pointing that out.
Great. So here's a question from Amandine. They say, "Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. Do you think we can retain what Mills's notion of ignorance captures, that is, the phenomena it tracks in the world, without using that label? Regarding your suggestion that we should use the notion of vice instead, I wonder if this runs the risk of individualizing the problem and obscuring the structural dimension of the problem."
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to defer a little bit, Amadine, to the previous point I made. Hopefully, you heard it in the discussion itself. So I'm not convinced that just speaking in terms of vice epistemology is going to solve the whole problem. But I do think so. I had this reaction initially to the epistemologies of ignorance literature in general. I think the epistemologies of ignorance literature is really good a lot of the time, and that what the thing to worry about is the way that the notion of ignorance is getting cashed out. But I don't think, for instance, the things that are being identified, say the structural barriers to the abolition of white ideological thinking, are incorrectly conceived. But I think the way that they're problematized might depend in an important way on a notion of ignorance that's smuggling in this kind of ableist apparatus. So if we consider that as like a module, then I think we can just, if we do the work and go back and look for it, we can probably make the relevant changes and it would be compatible. Hopefully, I don't know.
That's great. That's great. So here's a question from Cynthia. Thanks so much for this really interesting talk. I wonder if it might be worth distinguishing the psychological from the cognitive. I agree that it's insulting and ableist, and also just a wrong diagnosis, to attribute cognitive impairment, for example, to Trump supporters. However, I do think there's a psychological explanation for why some people are attracted to Trump's view and are willing to support it, even when it involves denying certain obvious facts about reality, such as the fact that no voter fraud occurred. One need not conceptualize the psychological traits that encourage people to support Trump as an impairment.
Cool, great. I think that's a fantastic distinction. So that's a slip for me for sure. I'm thinking of the worry I have is that some kinds of ideology talk specifically treat the presence, the perceived ideology or ideological thinking as a symptom of an individual psychological, and here's the important bit, psychological flaw. And so that I'm just identifying as maybe the more materialist or a different way of saying cognitive flaw. But you're right, there could be psychological explanations, whether individualized or larger, that are not fundamentally cognitive explanations. That's a great distinction to make. I think that's perfectly, I would be happy to make that change in how I'm writing this. Yeah, I'd have to think of some ways. Part of what I'd have to do is try to pursue examples of psychological explanations that aren't ultimately just accounts of psychological flaw or impairment or something like that. But I'm convinced that you're right at first blush, so I think that's good. Thanks for raising that.
So, are there other questions? Shelley, Jonathan?
I think we have Andrea's question in the Q&A that hasn't been asked yet. Is that right?
We have a question from George DeRoy that Sally can take a look at.
Okay. Let me go in here. And Andrea.
Well,
okay.
Andreas.
Yeah, Andreas. Maybe Andreas was earlier, so we could start with that one and then go to George. So Andreas says, thank you for this fantastic work, Alex. My question is about the class status and or rural urban status as playing a role in the ableism that you're describing as part of the yokel or redneck tropes that seem to be part of ideology talk. That is, does working class status play a role in the kind of ableism that you're analyzing? And if such ideology talk is not specifically about working class white people, how might the denigrating claims of cognitive deficit within ideology talk span class status? And what might be the implications of this for interpreting ableist views about cognitive impairment and labor? Many thanks again for this great presentation.
Interesting. Yeah, and thank you so much, Indra. This is a great question. So there's another paper to write, I guess. I think you're absolutely right to pick up on this. One thing, so I think if I was to describe what I encounter most often, given my political background, is the dynamic of people who are highly educated, traditionally white and upper or middle class, denigrating people who are of lower or blue collar working backgrounds for their politics in this way. And so the dynamic I'm most familiar with is the redneck trope that reflects a kind of classism as well, as you're identifying. But I'm not sure that it only operates in that way. So I think that's one special way that like the notion of white working class folks are being denigrated by people in a different position in the class structure. And obviously I think that's also specifically racial. But the dynamic I think also works the opposite way. So I don't spend a ton of time watching Fox News, but I do have family members in the States who spend a lot of time watching Fox News, who have an inverted perspective on exactly this. They think that West and East coastal elites are exactly the same kind of, have exactly the same kinds of issues that see kind of lampooned in the left media that I consume. And so while I don't think it's exclusively a matter of the denigration of white working class folks, I think that's probably the place, especially given the yokel and redneck tropes, where we see it being especially obvious that class is doing a lot of work. Maybe that makes it a little bit more permissionist, but I'm not convinced that it's exclusively a matter of that direction of fit from upper class to lower class. Yeah, I think it's classically the example. I mean, any cartoon I've ever seen has some kind of yokel character that gets treated in this way, I think kind of horrifically. The labor point I think is interesting too. So I think it makes perfect sense to think that say middle class or upper class knowledge workers might have this reaction to people who labor in a non-knowledge economy, factory workers or manual laborers. So that fits too. There's definitely a class, like a deeper class discussion to have here. But then I also think we could pursue that along specifically racial lines and other lines as well. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. I think this would be an interesting line to pursue.
Okay, let's see. So George has a question. So initially it was about which McGowan, and I offered the reference. But there's also, what about a Lacanian, I think it is, Hegelian psychoanalytic epistemology in which the critique of ideology does not take place within a historicist and rather limited view within discourse. Do you see any value in this latter approach?
Yes, thank you, Georges. This is so I'll start by saying I need to admit that I have read 0 words from Lacan and unfortunately have so little background in psychoanalysis, but I keep bumping into it. So I think I need to spend a summer reading psychoanalysis to catch up. The Hegelian side, Hegelian ideology critique. I wish, if you can say a little bit more about this, I would be interested. If the idea is that like, well, I guess that's just a Marxist view. So I'm trying to think of let me just read your question out again. What about a Lacanian Hegelian psychoanalytic epistemology in which the critique of ideology does not take place within historicist framework, but rather in a view within discourse? So I guess my guess, not knowing the Lacan reference, my guess is that you're saying, well, what if it's not just like in this broad context? What if it's about the inferiority claim is between people? What if the struggle is a matter of superiority or epistemic inferiority between 2 people? And I think probably the problem will still live there in an individualized way. But I'm sorry, I think I don't understand your question well enough to answer it. So if you want to chat more about this, I'm interested. I just don't think I get it. So I'm sorry about that. Thanks.
So I think we have just a couple more minutes. Shelley, do you have a question?
I do have something I can ask Alex. I had a number of questions that you've already addressed with in response to other people, but I'm thinking about, because I use Foucault a lot in my work, and because of what he does in his work with respect to inverting common understandings of causal relations. I tend to do that myself in my work. And so I was thinking about how constitution is happening in your claims about how disability talk constitutes ideology talk. And I think that maybe we should also think about how ideology talk constitutes disability talk, and how ideology talk constitutes what is taken to be impairment.
Yeah, interesting. Great show. Thanks. So one way you might say this. Here's the science and technology studies phrasing. You might say that they co-constitute each other, or that it's a matter of co-production. Yeah, I think that has to be right in terms of causal connection. Surely if ideology talk reinscribes this notion of whether it's cognitive impairment or just naturalized epistemic impairment, that's going to end up bearing on how we conceive of just what it means to have a cognitive impairment or an intellectual disability at all. And so, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, so, I mean, we can think in terms of, my work, I've talked about how reproductive technologies and, stem cell research, how these practices and mechanisms and technologies actually constitute what we take to be impairment, or what we think impairment is. And what I'm saying is that ideology talk can also be constitutive of impairment in that way.
Yeah, so here's an example. I think, so intelligence, of course, is the eugenic history of intelligence assessment is a great illustration of this. If you think that unintelligence and certain beliefs or certain perspectives on the world go hand in hand, you're going to end up treating people differently than you do. So think about the way, say, in the 18th and 19th centuries, that that indigenous peoples were, like the genocide of indigenous peoples in part involved a view of unintelligence and certain political organizations of those peoples, into like their nations and things like this, going hand in hand. I think that the eugenic view of the need to abolish those groups of people and their practices is a matter of sorry, I'm fumbling this a bit, but that's the example that my mind goes to right away. And I think there's a very similar thing happening both in Canada and the United States in the racial histories of how eugenic policies were exercised. I think you're absolutely right.
So I have to unmute, sorry. That was great. Wonderful talk, wonderful Q&A, great answers, great questions. So I think we should take a moment now to thank Alex and then move into the break. So congratulations, Alex, good job.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. That was such a powerful and clear talk. So much to think about there. And Sally, thank you so much for sharing it so ably and engaging in and running the discussion.